Merry Christmas from the Bible Priest channel. Merry December 25th. It is my intention to defend the traditional date of Christmas. Every year about this time, there come to be documentaries about how ancient Christians did not celebrate Christmas, but later on, they established the Feast of Christmas to counteract a pagan festival called Sol Invictus, or the day of the birth of the unconquered sun, which was celebrated in late ancient Rome on the shortest day of the year in the Julian calendar of the time, December 25th. We have guilt by association here. Sol Invictus and Christmas, both on the same date, the shortest date of the year. Now, Sol Invictus was not a very ancient feast. It was instituted about 275 AD by a Roman emperor, and the first evidence of Christians celebrating on that date is about 50 years later, which is not a very long time. It's just as possible that Sol Invictus was instituted to countermand Christmas as that Christmas was instituted to countermand Sol Invictus. I say this because, yes, it is true that we do not have evidence of Christmas being celebrated earlier than about 325, but we know for sure that Sol Invictus was instituted on 275. Therefore, the real distance between them may be zero or into minus numbers, that is, Christmas predating Sol Invictus rather than coming after it. So if Sol Invictus is not the cause of Christmas, what is? And the answer is the Gospel of Luke is the cause of the celebration of Christmas. The Gospel of Luke is the cause for the celebration of many of our feast days. We would not have the Feast of Pentecost if it were not for the writings of St. Luke at the end of his Gospel and at the beginning of the Acts of the Apostles. The other three evangelists don't tell us about the Pentecost event, only Luke does. We have the Feast of the Ascension on the 40th day after Easter because of St. Luke. We have the presentation of the child Jesus in the temple on the 40th day after his birth, only because of the narrative of Luke. We have the Annunciation of the birth of John the Baptist and of Jesus, only from Luke. We have the birth of John only in Luke. These are all solemnities of the church year that entirely rely upon the narratives and the timing indications provided in Luke's Gospel. Luke had a picture in his mind of how the events of salvation history related to each other temporally, and he dropped this information into his account so that the church mined from it the extrapolation of the feast days. So, where does it all begin? It begins with the announcing of John the Baptist by the Archangel Gabriel, which took place in the 9th month of our calendar, which is the first month of the Jewish calendar. Yom Kippur is one of the holiest days of the Jewish calendar. Now, all Jews fast from food and drink for the entire day, which is a pretty serious fast. And later in that day, the high priest would go to the temple, enter the sanctuary, the holy place, 3 times, and the high priest was the only person who could ever go in there, and he only went in 1 day a year, and that was on Yom Kippur. So John the Baptist's father is assuming this role of entering the sanctuary, the holiest place. And we know exactly when that event was scheduled each year. It was a few days after Jewish New Year on the great feast of Yom Kippur. So John the Baptist was announced in September, approximately at the fall equinox, when night and day are equal. Then Luke proceeds to tell us that the birth of Jesus is announced by the same archangel 6 months later. So the fall equinox is the announcing of John, and the spring equinox is the announcing of Jesus. You see the beautiful symmetry of Luke's chronology. John is exactly 6 months older than Jesus. John's announcement of birth comes at the beginning of autumn. Jesus' announcement of birth comes at the beginning of spring. If this is what's happening 6 months apart at the announcements, then 9 months later, the entire calendar shows us that John will be born at the beginning of summer, and Jesus will be born at the beginning of winter. So that each one of the 4 seasons of the year begins with an event in connection with the origins of Jesus and John the Baptist. John is announced in the fall. Jesus is born in the winter. Jesus is announced in spring, and John is born in summer. The 4 events constitute a quadration of the calendar year and provide indications of how we should celebrate and when we should celebrate our feasts. So the announcement of John the Baptist doesn't get a celebration for some reason, but the birth of Jesus is on December 25th, the announcing of Jesus on March 25th, and the birth of John on June 24th, because of Luke, not because of Sol Invictus, because Luke comes 200 years before Sol Invictus, before anyone heard of it. Luke did not assign these dates for their solar or pagan connotations. If anything, they are connected to the Jewish feasts, because Yom Kippur begins roughly the season of autumn, Hanukkah begins roughly the season of winter, and Passover begins roughly the season of spring. It doesn't seem to be a Jewish feast initiating the summer for some reason. They were too busy harvesting to have pilgrimages at that time. Okay, so December 25th is not a pagan invention adopted by the church. It could be a church invention adopted by the late pagans who were trying to compete with and suppress the rising Christian movement. How do we account then for the fact that the Christmas celebration does not appear in the earliest of the calendars of church feasts? Well, birthdays are not very common in our church calendars. We only have 3 birthdays in the Roman calendar today: the birth of Jesus, the birth of John the Baptist, and the birth of Mary, a minor feast in September. So these, it's not surprising that we would not find a birthday in the early church calendars. There weren't many birthdays, or hardly any at all in those days, and still are hardly any today. I believe the church had an aversion to celebrating birthdays because the Roman pagans were very big on birthdays. There was the birthday of every emperor. It was a known date. It was celebrated throughout the empire. There were temples to the emperor. Pagan offerings were made, sacrifices of animals and plants and incense. and pagans of the Roman Empire were required to come and celebrate the birthday of the emperor personally. The month of July has that month name because that was the month in which Julius Caesar was born. The month Augustus has that month name because that was the month in which the Emperor Augustus was born. And Christians were rounded up and told they had to worship the emperor as a god on his birthday like everybody else. And if they didn't, then they had a big celebration and let the lions eat the Christians. So after millions of Christians were eaten by lions on birthdays of the emperor, birthdays of major public figures were anathema to the Christian spirit. They had been polluted by martyrdoms and burnings and animal meals, and you can see why they would not be anxious to put Jesus on the same level as the Emperor Hadrian or the Emperor Augustus or the Emperor Julius Caesar and have him celebrated too. So I believe the Christmas only entered the calendar of Christian feasts after the pagan celebrations of imperial birthdays had been suppressed by Constantine. Then Jesus could come to the fore and claim his rightful birth date, and no one would be forced to worship him on that day and martyred if they did not. So the date of the birth of Jesus lay dormant in the Christian consciousness. Perhaps they celebrated at home without public celebrations. And after the pagan birthdays with their false worship were abolished, then Christmas could come into its own, because Luke had laid down the tracks for us to know when the birth of Jesus had taken place. We don't know exactly which year it was, but we have a real good idea of which day of the year it was, because Luke was an excellent researcher and he was an excellent reporter, and we can rely on Luke. He was not only inspired, he was well informed. So with full assurance on the authority of St. Luke and of the Holy Spirit, I tell you, Merry December 25th, everybody. See you next year real soon.